I lost my voice before I even understood why my hands were shaking. The cup was already in my grip when the nurse leaned close and whispered, "Don't drink that," like she was breaking a rule just by saying it. My wife stood at the foot of the bed, staring at the floor. No one explained. No one stopped what was happening. And I knew if I swallowed, something permanent would be decided for me. I woke fully when the cup touched my lips, because fear sharpened everything, and the ceiling lights felt too close. The nurse's whisper still rang, and my throat locked, while my wife stayed silent at the bed's end there watching. I tried to ask questions, but the words refused me, as if permission had already been revoked without warning. Today, machines hummed nearby, counting something I didn't control, and I sensed decisions stacking beyond my reach in that small room. When I looked at my wife, she avoided me, which hurt worse than any needle I had felt before here. Someone adjusted the IV, speaking gently, yet never to me, and I felt reduced to paperwork on a rolling tray. I remembered agreeing to tests, not outcomes, and that difference suddenly mattered more than breath or comfort, safety, dignity, control. The nurse returned with another cup, eyes apologetic, hands steady, like she'd practiced this moment too many times before now. My wife finally spoke, telling me to trust them, but her voice sounded rehearsed and distant, careful, thin, controlled, practiced. That was when I realized trust had already been spent, without asking me first, by people I loved, feared, obeyed. A doctor entered, flipping pages, discussing numbers aloud, as if I were absent from my own body. Life, fate, today. He asked my wife a question, not me, and waited patiently for her answer while I stared, silent, shaking, listening. She nodded once, small and quick, sealing something I could not undo even if I begged, screamed, resisted, fought hard. I tried lifting my hand, but restraints disguised as comfort kept me down against sheets, rails, rules, signatures, authority, power. Panic rose quietly, because panic loud would have punished me with sedation, labels, notes, decisions, consequences, silence, shame, loss, erasure. I wondered how we arrived here. From checkup talk, to whispered warnings that felt forbidden, dangerous, urgent, immediate, final, irreversible. Memories surfaced of my son arranging appointments, insisting on convenience for everyone involved, especially them, not me anymore. Now, today. He'd said hospitals confuse older men, and I laughed then, trusting him like a fool, proud, relaxed, careless, blind, content. That laughter echoed bitterly, as the doctor asked about consent forms, signed, stored, scanned, approved, witnessed, validated, filed, executed, binding. My wife answered again, describing my wishes in a voice I didn't recognize as mine. True, honest, loving, familiar, safe. I felt my authority drain, replaced by a calm that wasn't mine but theirs. Engineered, clinical, imposed, efficient, quiet, absolute. The nurse met my eyes, briefly. Regret flickering, before turning away to record, adjust, comply, obey, proceed, finalize, conclude everything. I tried to remember what exactly I'd agreed to earlier during rush talks, crowded hallways, family-led explanations, pressure, fatigue, trust. Each recollection ended with someone else filling in blanks. For me, kindly, firmly, confidently, publicly, legally, irreversibly, decisively, without appeal. That pattern now felt deliberate, a net tightening while I lay still beneath lights, rules, glances, pens, forms, hands, power. The cup hovered again, inches from my mouth, time thickening around us with dread, urgency, consequences, permanence, inevitability, pressure, silence. I shook my head, barely, hoping someone would notice resistance as refusal, fear, protest, humanity, consent, dignity, ownership, survival, choice. The doctor paused, then asked my wife if we should proceed with treatment, plan, protocol, schedule, authority, direction, approval, action. She hesitated finally, a crack opening that terrified me more than certainty, because cracks can close, harden, vanish, betray, collapse. I wondered what she stood to lose if she changed her mind right then, publicly, officially, forever, legally, financially, morally. The answer arrived in her eyes. Calculating, distant, resigned, weighing outcomes, consequences, responsibilities, expectations, pressure, promises, leverage, control, fear, benefit. She said proceed softly, and my chest tightened like a door closing without keys. Warning, appeal, mercy, witness, sound, return. The nurse looked away again, and I understood my warning had limits inside this system. Hierarchy, process, routine, machine, apparatus. As the cup touched me, I felt my world narrow dangerously toward compliance, sedation, silence, erasure, absence, dependency, obedience, loss. I needed a way out, but exits require allies I lacked here. Now, publicly, legally, physically, emotionally, socially, structurally, entirely. My thoughts raced to my children, wondering who orchestrated this quietly, patiently, strategically, respectfully, invisibly, effectively, completely, thoroughly, deliberately, together. Had they agreed already, believing they knew better than me about safety, finances, care, legacy, control, burden, outcomes, optics, narratives? The idea cut deep, because I'd taught them independent strength, honesty, respect, consent, courage, boundaries, fairness, listening, accountability, trust, love. Now independence meant deciding my life without my participation, approval, understanding, presence, consent, voice, dignity, agency, say, power, choice, involvement. The cup tipped, and I felt tears I refused to release yet, because surrender would help them, not me, survive. Somewhere inside, resolve formed, fragile but real, insisting I remember, observe, endure, survive, record, wait, plan, resist, reclaim, expose, confront. If I couldn't stop this moment, I could mark it mentally, emotionally, deliberately, precisely, permanently, accurately, painfully, truthfully, carefully, forever. I watched faces, listened to tones, stored details like evidence for later, when silence broke, when questions mattered, when reckoning. The nurse's warning replayed, proof someone knew this was wrong enough to risk, whispering, consequences, punishment, censure, blame, danger, fallout. That knowledge steadied me as the liquid finally crossed my lips against my will. Choice, consent, dignity, authority, future, self, warmth spread, and control slipped further away than before, despite resistance, memory, resolve, anger, clarity, awareness, fear, certainty, hope, identity. I focused on staying awake, counting breaths, anchoring myself against drifting, compliance, forgetting, obedience, sedation, surrender, erasure, disappearance, darkness, loss. The room blurred, but my wife's posture stayed unchanged, distant, composed, protected, justified, insulated, resolved, aligned, defended, supported, unmoved, certain. I understood. Then this wasn't care, it was control, Exercise calmly, legally, collaboratively, politely, efficiently, conclusively, confidently, collectively, decisively, and as my vision dimmed, I promised myself this wouldn't end here quietly, safely, acceptably, neatly, conveniently, for them, ever. I didn't sleep so much as disappear in fragments, surfacing just long enough to feel the weight of decisions pressing down again. Voices drifted in and out, careful, professional, distant, never asking if I could hear them, assuming I couldn't respond. My body felt heavy, borrowed, like it belonged to the bed more than it belonged to me anymore. I tried to move my fingers, and when they barely twitched, relief mixed with dread instead of comfort. Being awake meant knowing what was happening, and knowing felt more dangerous than being gone. When my eyes finally focused, the room looked rearranged, like time had moved without my consent. The cup was gone, replaced by paperwork clipped near my bed, labels facing outward, ready for inspection. My wife sat in a chair now, closer than before, but still not close enough to touch me. She smiled when she noticed my eyes open. A practiced smile that asked for nothing and offered less. I searched her face for guilt, fear, regret, anything human, but found management instead. She told me everything went well, that the doctors were pleased, that I'd been confused earlier. The word confused landed like an accusation, subtle but sharp, rewriting my experience in real time. I tried to speak, but my tongue felt thick, unreliable, betraying me with slowness and slur. She leaned forward, touching my arm gently, as if demonstrating concern for an invisible audience. Her touch felt unfamiliar, like proof of affection rather than affection itself. A doctor arrived soon after, speaking calmly, praising cooperation, noting improvement, adjusting plans already decided. He spoke to me, but not for me, the way one talks to furniture while rearranging a room. I forced myself to focus, to track every word, every implication hidden behind reassurance and medical authority. He mentioned safety, stability, long-term planning, words that sounded responsible, but felt like cages. When I asked what exactly had been administered, he glanced at my wife before answering. That glance told me more than his explanation ever could. It said permission had been transferred, ownership reassigned, responsibility redistributed quietly. I felt anger rise, but anger needs leverage, and I had none in that bed. Instead, I nodded slowly, pretending acceptance while memorizing tone, sequence, behavior. I learned then that survival sometimes means appearing cooperative, while preparing for resistance. After he left, my wife spoke quickly, filling silence before I could use it. She said the children agreed this was best, that everyone was worried, that I'd scared them. The way she said everyone felt rehearsed, like consensus built without dissent allowed. I asked which child raised concerns first, and her answer came too fast to be spontaneous. That told me the story had been practiced, maybe even written together. I remembered conversations at home, subtle shifts I'd dismissed as care, questions about finances framed as planning, suggestions about downsizing, framed as relief. My son insisting I sign documents, just in case my daughter watching quietly instead of objecting. Each moment replayed now with different meaning, like clues rearranged into a pattern. What I'd mistaken for concern had been coordination. A nurse entered to check vitals, different from the one who warned me earlier. This one avoided my eyes entirely, efficient, polite, uninterested in my thoughts or consent. I asked her if I could see my chart, and she said the doctor would handle questions. Deflection had become the default response, smooth and practiced. That's when I understood this wasn't about health anymore. It was about control. My wife stood to leave, saying she needed to make calls, handle arrangements. Arrangements for what? I wondered, when I wasn't told what phase I was in, before she reached the door. I asked her one question, quietly. Did I ever say, I wanted this? She paused, just long enough to confirm the answer mattered. She didn't respond directly. Instead, she said she couldn't watch me suffer, that someone had to make hard decisions, that justification scared me more than any admission would have. People who believe they're saving you feel entitled to override you. And entitlement, once granted, rarely returns what it takes. When she left, the room felt smaller, heavier, more official. I tested my voice again, speaking slowly, deliberately, to reclaim it piece by piece. I told myself to stay alert, to resist sedation, to observe everything. If I was being repositioned in my own life, I needed proof, leverage, witnesses. Silence would make their version permanent. Later, another staff member arrived with forms, explaining updates to my care plan. She spoke as if I'd already agreed, pointing to sections highlighted in yellow. My name appeared on signatures I didn't remember making, written in familiar handwriting. I asked when these were signed, and she answered without certainty, which mattered. Uncertainty creates cracks, and cracks let truth escape. I asked to speak with a patient advocate. The request changed the room's temperature immediately. She said she'd note it and left faster than necessary. That reaction told me I'd crossed an invisible line they preferred patients not see. I lay back, heart pounding, knowing I'd forced a new variable into their system. Time passed unevenly after that, measured by interruptions rather than clocks. Each return brought someone new, another explanation, another adjustment. I noticed they never left me alone long enough to think clearly. Constant presence became another restraint, softer but effective. Still, the idea of an advocate stayed with me, grounding my resolve. When my wife returned, she seemed tense, less composed than before. She asked if I'd been comfortable, if I needed anything, watching my face closely. I told her I'd requested an advocate, keeping my voice steady. Her smile faltered, just slightly, before she recovered. That crack told me I was no longer fully contained. She warned me gently about causing delays, about confusion, about unnecessary stress. I listened without responding, letting her words hang between us. For the first time, she looked uncertain, like someone recalculating risk. I realized then this situation depended on my compliance more than I'd thought, and compliance once withdrawn changes everything. As she spoke, I felt the weight shift, not in my favor yet, but away from certainty. I didn't know how far this went, or who else was involved. But I knew one thing clearly now. Whatever plan they had made for me assumed I wouldn't push back. And that assumption was about to become their first mistake. The advocate didn't arrive right away, which told me something else was happening behind the scenes. Hospitals move fast when they want to, and slowly when they hope you'll forget what you asked for. Every time footsteps approached, my body tightened, ready to listen, to catch tone, hesitation, urgency. I stopped closing my eyes, afraid rest would be mistaken for consent. Staying awake became my quiet rebellion. A nurse I hadn't seen before entered, older, steadier, carrying herself differently than the rest. She introduced herself by first name only, which felt intentional, almost defiant. She checked my chart, then looked at me longer than necessary, like she was measuring something. When she spoke, she asked how I was feeling, not how I was doing. That difference mattered more than she knew. I told her I felt overridden, not confused, choosing my words carefully. She didn't correct me or soften it, just nodded once and adjusted the monitor. Then she said, the advocate was busy but aware, which felt like a half-truth. Before leaving, she asked if anyone had explained the changes clearly. I said no, and she paused, pen hovering, before writing something down. That pause stayed with me after she left. It felt like a crack widening. Slowly, silently. I replayed everything again, reconstructing the path that led here. The first appointment, my son insisted on attending, the way he answered questions for me. The look my wife gave him when I hesitated. Subtle, practiced, decisive. I trusted them, because trust is what keeps families functioning. But trust also creates blind spots, and blind spots are easy to exploit. I wondered when concern turned into coordination, when help turned into strategy. Had they discussed this openly, or framed it as necessity, inevitability, kindness? The thought that they believed they were right unsettled me more than malice would have. Another doctor arrived, different from before, carrying authority in his posture. He spoke plainly, explaining updated assessments, using words like capacity and best interest. Those words landed heavy, because they weren't about my body but my agency. I asked him directly if my consent was required for what was planned. He hesitated, then said consent had already been addressed. I asked when, and he cited documentation. I asked if I could see it, and he said later, deflecting smoothly. The pattern repeated, and patterns confirm intention. He explained risks of non-compliance, framing resistance as danger. That's how control justifies itself, by redefining dissent as harm. When he left, I felt smaller, but clearer. They weren't improvising, they were executing. My wife returned shortly after, her movements sharper now, less gentle. She asked what I'd said, what I'd asked, who I'd spoken to. Concern had shifted into surveillance. I told her I wanted clarity, nothing more. She sighed, as if burdened, and reminded me of everything she'd handled over the years. The argument wasn't loud, but it was heavy, layered with obligation and guilt. She said I owed it to the family to cooperate. That word, owed, stuck with me. Long after she finished speaking, I asked her if she believed I couldn't decide for myself anymore. She didn't answer immediately, and silence spoke loudly enough. When she finally said she believed I was tired, overwhelmed, vulnerable, I heard substitution. Vulnerable had replaced capable without my consent. That shift justified everything else. A staff member entered with a tablet, asking me to confirm information. I answered slowly, deliberately, making sure my responses were clear. She smiled politely, but I noticed her fingers hovering over options before I finished speaking. I corrected her once, firmly, and her smile thinned. That told me my clarity disrupted their narrative. The advocate still hadn't come. Instead, my son appeared, unexpectedly, standing at the foot of the bed like my wife had earlier. Seeing him there tightened my chest more than the machines ever could. He spoke confidently, reassuringly, telling me everything was under control. I asked him whose control he meant. He said everyone agreed this was best. I asked him if he believed I was incapable. He avoided the question, talking instead about safety, responsibility, burden. He said he was protecting me. Protection offered without consent is just another form of force. I asked him if he'd signed anything. He said no, too quickly. I asked him if he'd discussed this outcome before I was admitted. He hesitated, then said they'd considered possibilities. Possibilities don't end with locked decisions unless someone chooses them. I told him I didn't agree to what was happening. His expression shifted, frustration flashing before composure returned. He said disagreement was expected, that adjustment takes time. That sentence frightened me more than anger would have. It assumed resistance was temporary and irrelevant. When he left, I felt something harden inside me. They were waiting me out, counting on fatigue, medication, confusion. I realized then time was working against me. Unless I changed the equation, I needed someone outside this circle, someone not invested in convenience or control. The advocate wasn't enough if the system delayed them. I asked the next nurse who entered for a phone. She said calls were limited. That rest was important. I asked again, citing my rights. She looked uncomfortable, then said she'd check. Checking became another form of delay. Eventually she returned with the phone, placing it just within reach. I dialed slowly, hands unsteady, choosing carefully. I didn't call family. I called someone who'd known me long before this narrative existed. Someone who wouldn't accept confusion as explanation. As the call connected, my wife re-entered the room. She saw the phone, her eyes widening just slightly. I held her gaze for the first time since waking. Whatever I was about to say would change things, and we both knew it. I spoke into the phone, steady despite the tremor in my hand, and asked for help. Her expression shifted, then not to anger but calculation. I understood in that moment I'd crossed a threshold they hadn't anticipated. Whatever plan they'd built assumed silence and compliance. Now there was a witness forming outside these walls, and I could feel the situation tightening, not easing as consequences moved closer. The call ended faster than I wanted, not because I was done speaking, but because footsteps approached with purpose. I slid the phone back onto the tray just as my wife stepped closer, her voice softer than before. She asked who I'd called, as if curiosity alone explained the question, but her eyes searched my face urgently. I told her I'd reached out for clarity, not help, choosing words that wouldn't escalate yet. She nodded, though the nod felt like acknowledgement of a problem, not understanding of my fear. Within minutes, 2 staff members entered together, their timing too precise to be coincidence. One introduced herself as a supervisor, the other remained silent, watching me carefully. They spoke about protocols, about patient stress, about the importance of rest. Their language framed my actions as symptoms, rather than choices, which felt deliberate. I listened without interrupting, letting them finish constructing their version of events. When I responded, I spoke slowly, deliberately, making sure each word landed clearly. I said I wanted transparency, not confrontation, and that I expected explanations directed to me. The supervisor smiled politely, but her eyes flicked toward my wife before answering. That glance confirmed again who they believed held authority here. I felt anger, but I kept it buried, because anger would justify their restraint. They explained that decisions had been made in my best interest, based on assessments and family input. I asked, whose assessment outweighed my own stated wishes? The supervisor said capacity evaluations had been considered, carefully, professionally. I asked if I'd been informed of the results. She said discussions would happen at the appropriate time, another delay disguised as care. After they left, my wife sat down heavily, her composure thinning. She said I was making things harder than necessary, that cooperation would speed everything up. Speed toward what, I wondered, when no destination had been disclosed. I told her I needed honesty, not reassurance. She rubbed her temples, as if my insistence exhausted her. She finally admitted that conversations had happened before I was admitted, not plans. She insisted, just concerns, scenarios, contingencies. But contingencies don't produce signed forms and coordinated behavior without intent. I asked her. When she stopped believing I could decide for myself, she said it wasn't about belief. It was about responsibility. Responsibility is a dangerous word when it replaces consent. It allows people to act without permission while claiming moral high ground. I told her I felt erased, managed, reduced. She looked at me then with something like fear. Not guilt, fear of consequences, not of hurting me. Another nurse entered, announcing a medication adjustment. I asked what it was, and she explained calmly, clinically. I asked why it was necessary, and she deferred to the doctor. Deferral had become routine, a shield against accountability. I refused it, quietly, firmly, meeting her eyes. She hesitated, then said she'd note my refusal. That small acknowledgement felt like reclaiming a fragment of ground. My wife protested softly, saying refusal would complicate things. I said complication was preferable to silence. The nurse left, and the room felt charged with unresolved tension. I thought about the person I'd called, wondering if they'd understood urgency. Reaching outside the family felt like betrayal to my wife, but survival requires alliances. I replayed the warning whisper again, grounding myself in certainty that something was wrong. People don't risk reprimand to whisper unless they fear consequences. That fear had validated mine when nothing else would. Later, a different doctor came, younger, less polished. He explained options more openly, though still cautiously. I asked direct questions, and he answered without consulting my wife first. That shift mattered, even if subtle. It reminded me that not everyone here agreed completely. He mentioned evaluations, pending, decisions not final, that contradicted earlier certainty, and contradiction creates leverage. I asked for documentation. Citing my right to review, he said arrangements could be made. For the first time, possibility replaced inevitability. When he left, my wife accused me of undermining trust. I asked whose trust she meant. She said the doctors, the families, the systems. I told her trust without consent isn't trust. She stood, pacing, frustration replacing composure. She warned me about consequences, about prolonged stays, about labels. I listened, recognizing the tactic. Fear of inconvenience often keeps people compliant, but inconvenience felt trivial compared to losing agency permanently. I told her I wouldn't stop asking questions. The phone buzzed softly on the tray. A message notification. My heart jumped, though I kept my face neutral. She noticed the sound and asked what it was. I said I didn't know yet. That uncertainty unsettled her more than an answer would have. When she stepped out to speak with someone, I checked the message. It was brief, but it mattered. The person I'd called was on their way, asking for details. Relief surged, followed by fear of escalation. Outside involvement would force clarity, but also confrontation. I typed back carefully. Summarizing without accusation. Accuracy mattered more than emotion now. If this turned formal, my credibility would be tested. I pressed send, feeling the weight shift again. Something irreversible had been set in motion. My wife returned, her expression guarded. She asked if I needed anything, watching my hands. I said I needed time to think. She nodded, though impatience flickered. Time was no longer neutral. It favored whoever controlled the narrative. I lay back, staring at the ceiling, breathing steadily. I wasn't safe yet, but I wasn't alone either. Whatever came next would test relationships. Authority. Truth. I felt fear but also resolve sharpening beneath it. If they wanted silence, they'd already lost their chance. The knock came softer than expected, yet everyone in the room reacted, proving anticipation had already spread quietly before permission or explanations could arrive there. My wife straightened instantly, smoothing worry into composure, while I felt my pulse announce that outside involvement had finally breached their careful perimeter today here. When the door opened, a man I trusted stepped inside, carrying neither authority badges nor calm smiles, only recognition and urgency from years passed together. His eyes met mine first, not the staff, not my wife, and that single choice shifted the balance I'd been losing for too long now. He introduced himself clearly, stating our relationship, then asked why decisions were being discussed, without the person affected, answering present fully aware today here now. The supervisor reappeared almost immediately, voice measured, explaining procedures, while my ally listened silently, documenting details I'd struggled to capture alone earlier today inside here. For the first time, explanations slowed, words chosen carefully, because someone present could challenge contradictions instead of absorbing them quietly without question before now today. My wife spoke less, watching reactions, realizing narratives collapse when witnesses don't share emotional debts or unspoken family loyalties that bind decisions silently together usually. I asked again for documents, and this time no one deflected immediately, which felt like oxygen after prolonged suffocation inside this room until now. Finally, they promised retrieval, scheduling, follow-up, words that sounded procedural but represented measurable retreat from certainty they'd projected earlier with confidence toward me before today here. When the papers arrived, stacked neatly, my name repeated everywhere. I felt anger sharpen into focus instead of panic for once inside this place alone. Dates, initials, check marks told a story of momentum built while I trusted others to translate complexity honestly without bias, pressure, or interest benefiting them first. My ally asked precise questions, not emotional ones, and watched carefully which answers arrived smoothly and which stalled under scrutiny today here publicly now present. Each hesitation revealed pressure points, places where authority depended on assumption rather than agreement or proof from me personally before this moment today inside here. I corrected statements calmly, asserting memory, preference, and intent, forcing records to accommodate my voice again, despite resistance from them all earlier today inside here. The room's energy changed, no longer managing me, but managing risk, optics, and accountability beyond family convenience that guided decisions before today inside here alone. My wife noticed it too, her arguments shifting toward compromise, suggesting pauses, evaluations, conversations she'd resisted earlier when authority felt secure for her alone then. She avoided my eyes again, but now avoidance signaled uncertainty rather than control, and that mattered to everyone present watching closely today inside here now. I felt exhausted, but exhaustion came with clarity. Understanding lines crossed cannot be uncrossed without consequences for families, systems, authority, and trust after today here. Whatever happened next would redefine relationships, power, and safety, not just my medical outcome, but family dynamics, authority structures, and future interactions forever after this. I leaned back, conserving energy, knowing pressure would increase now that compliance was no longer guaranteed by my silence or fatigue today inside here alone. My ally stayed, anchoring the room, reminding everyone decisions carry witnesses when power shifts unexpectedly from private spaces into shared accountability today here now present. I didn't know the final outcome yet, only that something irreversible had already been prevented because questions finally entered this room today inside here now. That knowledge steadied me, even as fear lingered about retaliation, delay, or quiet punishment later from systems unused to challenge before today inside here now. As conversations paused, unresolved, I understood the danger hadn't ended. It had merely changed shape into something slower, quieter, strategic, waiting beyond this moment now. The room didn't empty after the papers were reviewed. It thinned, like pressure released in stages rather than all at once. Staff rotated in and out, each one careful now, aware they were being observed rather than obeyed automatically. My ally stayed near the wall, quiet but present, his presence changing how every sentence was shaped. My wife sat back down, farther from the bed than before, hands folded too tightly in her lap. No one rushed anymore, and that slowness felt intentional, strategic, uneasy. A different supervisor arrived. Older, sharper, less reassuring in tone. She acknowledged confusion, framed it as misalignment rather than error, and spoke about reassessment. Reassessment sounded neutral, but it meant delays, meetings, internal conversations I wouldn't be part of. I asked directly if anything irreversible had already been done. She answered carefully, saying measures were precautionary, which wasn't a denial. That non-answer settled heavily in my chest. Precautionary for whom, I wondered, when my autonomy had already been compromised. My ally asked for clarification on authority transfer, pointing to language that implied more than temporary oversight. The supervisor said wording could be adjusted, which meant it had been chosen deliberately before. Language doesn't drift into documents by accident. My wife finally spoke up, her voice defensive now instead of soothing. She said she'd acted out of fear, that she thought she was protecting me from myself. I listened, noticing how her explanation centered on intention, not impact. People cling to intention when impact becomes indefensible. I asked her why she hadn't told me any of this before admission. She said she didn't want to worry me. That answer landed wrong, because worry is lighter than erasure. I told her worry would have respected me. Silence had removed me. Her eyes filled, but the tears didn't soften what had already been done. Emotion arrived late, after leverage had shifted. The supervisor announced a temporary pause on further changes. Pending review. Pause wasn't relief. It was suspension. Suspension meant I was still not in control, just not being pushed forward. I asked if I could leave, once stable. She said discharge would be discussed later. Another familiar deferral. When she left, my ally leaned closer and spoke quietly. He told me to expect resistance disguised as process. Systems don't like being interrupted mid-decision. They regroup, reframe, and reassert when attention fades. I nodded, knowing fatigue would be my enemy now. Later, a nurse I recognized from earlier returned, the one who'd avoided my eyes. She moved differently this time. Slower, more deliberate. She checked my vitals and asked how I was feeling, then waited for the answer. I told her I felt watched. She didn't deny it, just said shifts were changing soon. That comment stayed with me. Shifts changing meant new people, new interpretations, new opportunities for narratives to be reset. I asked her quietly if I could speak with the same advocate I'd requested earlier. She said she'd follow up, her tone cautious, but not dismissive. Caution now felt like progress. My wife stepped out to take a call, and the room felt lighter without her. I hated that realization, because it confirmed a fracture I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. Families fracture when control replaces trust. I wondered how long this plan had existed beneath everyday conversations. The thought that it predated my illness unsettled me deeply. When she returned, she was more subdued. She said the children were concerned about delays and uncertainty. Concern again, always framed as collective anxiety rather than individual overreach. I asked if any of them had questioned the process. She said they trusted her judgment. That trust, I realized, had insulated her from scrutiny until now. I told her trust without transparency breeds mistakes. She said she felt attacked. I said accountability feels like attack to people unused to it. The words hung between us sharp and irreversible. As evening settled, conversations slowed but didn't stop. Staff spoke in hushed tones outside the door, glancing in occasionally. I knew discussions were happening without me again, just more carefully this time. My ally prepared to leave, promising to return soon. His departure reignited fear I'd barely contained. Before he left, he reminded me to document everything mentally. Dates, names, wording, behavior. Power leaves traces when it moves too fast. I thanked him, feeling both stronger and more exposed. When the door closed behind him, the room felt vulnerable again. A doctor I hadn't seen yet arrived late, explaining he'd reviewed my file. He spoke cautiously, acknowledging complexity, emphasizing safety. I asked him if safety included consent. He said consent was important, but context mattered. Context had become their favorite escape. He suggested observation overnight, framed as precaution. I recognized the pattern immediately. Overnight becomes extended. Extended becomes normal. Normal becomes permanent. I didn't agree, but refusal now required stamina. I wasn't sure I had. I asked, what would change by morning? He said they'd have more information. Information from where, I wondered. When my perspective remained secondary, I told him I would not consent to new measures without direct discussion. He noted it, his pen pressing hard against the paper. Pressure always surfaces in small gestures first. When he left, my wife sat silently, no longer trying to persuade. Silence can be tactical too. I sensed a recalibration happening, quieter, more patient. They would wait for exhaustion, for doubt, for cracks. I felt the weight of staying vigilant settle heavily. As lights dimmed, I stared at the ceiling, refusing rest again. Sleep felt dangerous now, like surrender. I replayed every interaction, searching for openings, allies, leverage. This wasn't over. It was entering a slower phase. And slow battles favor institutions unless individuals endure. I didn't know what morning would bring, only that pressure would return in another form. They hadn't backed down, they'd stepped sideways. Whatever plan existed was still alive, just adapting. I closed my eyes briefly, promising myself not to drift far. If I lost awareness again, I might lose everything. I stayed awake through the dim hours, measuring breath against resolve, refusing the comfort everyone insisted I needed. Each sound outside the door felt intentional, like planning disguised as routine. When the lights brightened, I sensed movement before faces appeared. Charts rustled, voices aligned. My wife entered last, careful, guarded, already braced. No greetings followed. A doctor spoke about observations, stability, readiness. I listened, noting what wasn't said. No one mentioned consent. No one asked preference. The pause afterward felt like a test, waiting for surrender. I recognized authority tightening quietly, preparing pressure behind professional smiles and clipped reassurances today. They explained overnight monitoring as precaution, yet precaution carried permanence when repeated often enough. I asked whether leaving was possible. Answers curved around certainty, never touching it. My wife nodded along, signaling agreement without speaking. That silent alignment felt heavier than argument. I pressed again, asking who decided observation outweighed my objection. The doctor referenced assessments, guidelines, committees. Committees don't see faces, they see patterns. I realized resistance now required precision, not volume. Emotion would be documented. Calm would be respected. I steadied my voice and asked for documentation directly, clearly without apology, while watching reactions tighten across the room. The request slowed everything. Papers were gathered, glances exchanged, assumptions recalculated. A nurse returned with measured politeness, explaining delays as logistics. Logistics hide intent effectively. My wife whispered that pushing might worsen outcomes. I told her outcomes already felt chosen without me. She flinched, then recovered. That flinch mattered, it revealed doubt. I focused on it, letting silence do work. Words couldn't, the doctor excused himself, promising updates. Promises functioned as pauses, not progress. I sensed strategy shifting, preparing patience instead of force. Waiting became their weapon, exhaustion the lever, time the quiet accomplice against my fading strength alone now. Hours passed unevenly, marked by checks and half-explanations. Food arrived I barely touched, suspicious of appetite's consequences. A new staff member introduced herself briskly, reviewing notes aloud. Hearing my situation summarized by strangers felt violating, each phrase stripped nuance, flattening me into risk categories. I corrected one detail. She adjusted it. Annoyed, that annoyance exposed dependence on compliance. I asked again for my chart. She said later, then left, later stretched like elastic. Threatening snapback. I reminded myself to conserve energy. Battles lost to fatigue. Don't look dramatic, just inevitable. They erase agency quietly. One delay at a time. My wife returned with coffee. She didn't drink, setting it down untouched. She said the children wanted reassurance. I asked whether reassurance required my silence. She didn't answer. Instead, she spoke about love, history, sacrifice. Those words tried to outweigh present harm. I told her love includes listening, even when answers complicate plans. She said I was making her the villain. I said stories choose villains when truth is avoided. Her jaw tightened. That tension replaced certainty. I sense fear of exposure growing. Exposure terrifies people who acted privately, assuming unity would protect them from consequences once questioned publicly now. Around midday, the advocate finally arrived, unannounced, composed, alert. She introduced herself to me first. That mattered. She asked me to explain, uninterrupted. I spoke steadily, recounting facts, Emphasizing consent, she took notes. Precise. Then she asked staff direct questions, watching answers carefully. The room stiffened. My wife spoke less again. The advocate explained rights, options, escalation paths. Hearing them aloud restored shape to my world. Rights exist, only when voiced. Silence shrinks them. I requested a formal review. The advocate nodded. Acknowledging receipt of my request, process had replaced presumption, at least temporarily within these walls for now. Here, the announcement unsettled everyone. A review meant records, timelines, accountability. It meant conversations outside this room. Staff adjusted tone instantly. Softer, cautious. My wife looked trapped between loyalty and fear. I felt both too, but relief edged through. Still, danger remained. Reviews move slowly. They allow time for influence. I asked whether I could leave during review. The advocate said it depended. Depends meant leverage, still contested. I understood then the fight wasn't over truth, but tempo. Whoever controlled pace controlled outcome. I needed endurance more than arguments now, because exhaustion could quietly reverse every fragile gain I had made. That evening, visitors were limited, framed as policy. My wife left reluctantly, promising updates. Alone again, I tested resolve against fear. Retaliation could come as neglect, delay, reclassification. Institutions punish subtly. I practiced speaking calmly, rehearsing facts. I memorized names. Documentation would be my shield. A nurse checked in, careful, respectful. She asked if I felt safe. The question surprised me. I said not entirely. She nodded and said she'd note it. Being noted felt like existence acknowledged again. Still, awareness carried risk, because records invite interpretation by those with agendas. When oversight fades and attention shifts elsewhere. Quietly then, night settled with unfinished business. I lay listening, refusing sleep again. The review promised protection, yet also exposure. Family bonds strained under light. I wondered how my children would respond when asked directly. Would they defend decisions or retreat? Uncertainty gnawed. Still, I felt stronger than before. Voice reclaimed partially can grow. Tomorrow would test whether process held. For now, I guarded awareness, knowing the plan hadn't died, only adapted. Pressure would return politely. I resolved to meet it prepared, alert, and unyielding, because losing ground again might be permanent, and no one would save me but myself this time. The advocate returned with a measured calm that suggested preparation rather than reassurance, and I sensed the room tightening again. She explained the review process plainly, outlining steps without promising outcomes, which felt honest but unsettling. Staff gathered near the door, careful not to interrupt, listening as if their silence could influence direction. I noticed how often eyes moved toward my wife, gauging her reaction before speaking. Power still leaned her way, though it no longer felt absolute. She asked me to recount events again, this time slower, ensuring nothing blurred into emotion. I focused on sequence, wording, behavior, keeping time references clear without guessing. The act of retelling strengthened my certainty, even as it drained energy. Each correction I made tightened the record against reinterpretation. Truth becomes durable when repeated consistently under scrutiny. My wife finally spoke, her voice controlled but strained. She framed her actions as urgency, fear, protection, repeating familiar justifications. The advocate listened, then asked when consent had been discussed directly with me. Silence followed, heavy and revealing. That silence did more than any accusation could. A supervisor attempted to redirect, citing complexity and professional judgment. The advocate acknowledged complexity but returned to consent again. Consent resisted deflection, anchoring the discussion where it mattered. I felt a strange relief watching authority struggle against a simple question. Simple questions expose elaborate overreach. They proposed additional evaluations, independent this time. Independence sounded promising, yet still delayed resolution. I asked whether evaluations could occur after discharge. The answer came cautious, non-committal, layered with concerns. Concern had become the currency of control here. My wife argued discharge would be unsafe. I asked, unsafe for whom? No one answered directly. The advocate noted the response carefully. Notes felt like leverage accumulating quietly. When the meeting ended, nothing resolved fully, but momentum shifted again. Staff dispersed slower than before. Conversations muted. My wife stayed seated, staring at the floor. I sensed she understood the ground had changed beneath her. Understanding doesn't equal acceptance, but it alters tactics. Later, my children arrived together, unexpectedly. Seeing them enter tightened my chest with hope and dread. They looked uncertain, scanning faces before meeting my eyes. I greeted them calmly, refusing visible desperation. Desperation invites dismissal. They spoke in turns, expressing worry, confusion, frustration. I listened, letting them finish without interruption. When I responded, I focused on facts, not feelings. I asked what they believed was happening. Their answers revealed partial truths shaped by others. I explained my perspective slowly, emphasizing consent and silence. The room grew tense as narratives collided. My wife tried to interject, but the advocate raised a hand. That gesture shifted everything. For once, interruption wasn't allowed. My son looked shaken, recalculating assumptions. My daughter avoided eye contact, processing quietly. I asked whether either had heard me agree to this plan. They hadn't. That absence echoed loudly. Family dynamics surfaced, layered with guilt and defensiveness. I resisted the urge to plead. Pleading weakens credibility. Instead, I asked for time and honesty. Time felt precious now. The advocate suggested a private family discussion later. I agreed, though. Uncertainty gnawed. Private conversations can heal or conceal. Which would happen depended on courage. I prepared for both. After they left, exhaustion hit hard. Staying alert demanded more than I had left. A nurse offered rest, framed as care. I asked what would change while I slept. She assured me nothing without discussion. Trust felt fragile, but I needed strength. I allowed brief rest, anchoring awareness. Sleep came shallow, interrupted by sounds and thoughts. When I woke, nothing obvious had changed. Obvious changes rarely announce themselves. Evening conversations resumed quietly. Staff remained cautious, measured. My wife spoke less, watching reactions. I sensed strategies forming, patient ones. Patience can be as dangerous as force. The advocate checked in again, confirming next steps. She reminded me to document interactions mentally. Her presence steadied me. Still, protection felt conditional. Conditions shift when attention fades. I reflected on how easily autonomy slips away, not through violence, but through concern. Concern accumulates until resistance looks unreasonable. I vowed not to confuse calm with safety again. Awareness would be my defense. As lights dimmed, unresolved questions hovered. Would evaluations free me or trap me longer? Would family confront truth or retreat into justification? Nothing felt settled. Instability remained the only constant. I stared at the ceiling, counting breaths, planning words. Tomorrow would demand clarity again. The plan against me hadn't vanished. It waited, adaptive, polite. I promised myself vigilance would not fade. Morning arrived without ceremony, the kind that pretends nothing is wrong while pressure quietly resumes its work. I woke with resolve intact but thinner, aware endurance had become the real contest now. A nurse checked vitals, careful, neutral, recording numbers that never capture fear or intent. She asked how I felt, and I said alert, choosing the word deliberately. Alert implied capacity, awareness, resistance, presence, ownership, still mine. The advocate returned early, carrying updates with restrained seriousness. Independent evaluations were scheduled, timelines outlined, processes activated beyond family control. She explained options again, emphasizing my voice mattered throughout. Hearing it reinforced steadiness, though doubt lingered about enforcement. Systems promise fairness. Vigilance tests whether promises hold. My wife entered later, alone this time, posture guarded. She said the children were conflicted, unsure what to believe now. Conflicted felt honest, and honesty cracked the wall built around me. I told her confusion was healthier than certainty built without consent. She listened, not agreeing but no longer arguing. She admitted fear had driven her. Fear of losing control over outcomes. I said control and care aren't the same, though they often masquerade. Her eyes softened briefly, then hardened with resolve. She warned consequences might follow if I kept resisting. Threats framed as warnings still carry threat weight. Evaluations began with questions asked directly to me. I answered steadily, refusing exaggeration or minimization. The evaluator listened, probing gently, noting responses without judgment. Being heard felt unfamiliar after days of deflection. Still, one evaluation wouldn't undo momentum alone. Between sessions, staff behavior shifted again, polite distance replacing authority. They waited now, watching results, avoiding commitments, waiting favors institutions, draining individuals quietly. I conserved energy, speaking only when necessary. Every word mattered more than volume ever could. My children returned separately this time, tension evident. My son apologized awkwardly, admitting assumptions guided him. My daughter asked questions, searching for alignment with truth. I answered calmly, resisting the urge to demand loyalty. Understanding must be chosen, not coerced. Family conversations peeled back layers of miscommunication. Plans framed as protection had grown into execution. I acknowledged their fear without excusing overreach. Boundaries became visible only after crossing them. That realization settled heavily between us. The advocate updated me again, confirming recommendations favored my autonomy. Relief surged, tempered by awareness. Recommendations aren't commands. I asked about discharge possibilities. She said discussions were moving in that direction. Direction felt better than suspension. My wife reacted quietly, disappointment mixing with relief. She said she hadn't meant to erase me. Intent doesn't restore agency once taken. I told her rebuilding trust would require listening first. She nodded, uncertain, perhaps understanding the cost. Paperwork arrived later, revised language reflecting consent explicitly. I read every line, asking questions, making changes. Staff waited, no longer rushing. Time felt reclaimed in small increments. Incremental control still counts when momentum shifts. When discharge was finally discussed, conditions were outlined carefully. Follow-ups, check-ins, safeguards. I agreed selectively, rejecting anything vague, but clarity protects both sides. Ambiguity invites repetition. As arrangements formed, exhaustion hit again. Fighting constantly drains even the resolute. I allowed rest now. Sensing danger had receded slightly. Sleep came deeper, less guarded. Waking later, I felt lighter but cautious. My wife packed belongings quietly, avoiding conversation. I thanked her for staying through the conflict. Gratitude didn't equal forgiveness, but it opened space. She accepted it silently. Silence can mean reflection, not only control. Leaving the room felt surreal. Hallways looked different when walking willingly. Staff nodded, respectful now. I didn't mistake courtesy for accountability. Memory would hold what records might not. Outside, air felt sharp, grounding. Freedom carries weight after confinement. I knew repercussions might follow quietly. Families remember. Challenges longer than systems do. Still, agency reclaimed is worth the cost. As we drove away, I watched reflections pass, thinking about trust. Trust requires conversation before action, not justification after. I resolved to speak earlier, louder, clearer, but silence had nearly rewritten my life. That lesson would stay. The danger hadn't been the hospital alone. It was comfort with decisions made without me. I survived because I noticed, resisted, endured. Others might not get that chance. Remembering that keeps vigilance alive. This story didn't end with revenge. It ended with boundaries drawn publicly. Consequences would unfold slowly, unpredictably. I accepted that uncertainty. Agency reclaimed once must be guarded forever.